hold this.
Good afternoon or good day to all of you, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Estefanía Rivera-Kumar, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. We are the Penn Institute for Urban Research Forum on Urban Informality, a group of early career researchers across different disciplines and institutions who explore how informality shapes urban development. We encourage interactions across academic and professional settings and seek to foster greater collaboration between researchers and practitioners working on issues of urban informality. For those of you who are not members, we encourage you to consider joining by scanning the QR code you see on the screen or clicking the link in the chat. The link should be there shortly. The other members of the Forum Steering Committee, Kimberly, Sam, Anushka, and I, are excited to welcome our distinguished panel of speakers to this month's Conversations on Informality, a seminar series that fosters dialogue on urban informality among researchers and practitioners. This month, we are discussing what is a rather timely issue: the impossibility of democracy at the US-Mexico border. As border violence continues to become normalized through policies and on-the-ground border policing, states implemented multiple institutional and legal barriers to hold border and immigration enforcement agencies accountable for rights violations, including retaliatory punishment against advocates aiding asylum seekers and populations who cross borders. This reality demonstrates the limits of democracy, where a state of exception becomes a norm, leading to informal practices to hold authorities accountable for abuse and criminalization. This seminar will explore how legal exception at the United States-Mexico border impact transborder commuters, asylum seekers, and advocates alike. It is my pleasure to introduce the two speakers on the panel today. Dr. Estefanía Castañeda Perez will present her research on transborder commuters' reluctance to complain after enduring abuse from U.S. Customs Border and Protection officers. She will highlight findings from her research and contextualize them with the constraints and experiences of migrants, humanitarian workers, and legal professionals. Dr. Castañeda Perez is a postdoctoral fellow at the Penn Migration Initiative and has a PhD and a master's degree in political science from UCLA and a bachelor's degree in political science with an honors minor in interdisciplinary studies from San Diego State University. Meanwhile, Otro Lado attorney, Erika Pinheiro, Esquire, will concentrate on the futility of filing civil rights complaints on behalf of migrants who have suffered serious abuse in border custody, the criminalization of humanitarian aid at the border, and a comparative analysis of processes in the United States and the European Union. As litigation and policy director of the direct legal services nonprofit Otro Lado, Erika Pinheiro leads her organization's efforts in filing class action lawsuits, challenging the Trump administration's attacks on the U.S. asylum system, as well as slave labor practices and severe medical neglect in immigration detention facilities. But before joining Otro Lado, Pinheiro administered one of the largest DACA programs in California, as well as representation programs for unaccompanied children. She also oversaw high-volume legal orientation programs for adults and children detained in immigration prisons. Pinheiro holds both a JD and a Master of Public Policy from Georgetown University and is trained in econometric analysis of immigration policy. I will moderate today's panel. Before I hand it over to Dr. Estefanía Castañeda Perez, I just wanted to let you know that we are recording this session. While the panelists present, we will mute all attendees. However, we ask you to put your name, organization, and where you're calling in from in the chat. We also strongly encourage you to place your questions in the Q&A, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. I'll now hand it over to Dr. Estefanía for her presentation, after which we will hear from Erika.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Stephanie. And I also want to thank everybody that has generated this session a possibility. Let me just go to my presentation. Okay, well, I'm very excited to be able to share this space with Erika. And also my work focuses specifically on the experiences of transborder commuters. And these are people that reside in Mexican border cities, but regularly cross the border into the United States for various purposes. And I will talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. But I also will draw parallels about the effects of punishment beyond the transborder community. So I want to start by saying the importance of holding authorities accountable. It's in general, outside of immigration enforcement, for example, holding authority figures accountable for rights violations without the fear of retaliation is a fundamental freedom, typically separating a democracy from a repressive regime. In the United States, protected under the US First Amendment, the right to denounce law enforcement is essential to deter US government and state actors from subjugating people into complete subordination. However, protection from retaliation for denouncing abuses, specifically civil rights violations, have always been limited and in fact criminalized at the Mexico-US border. Racial profiling, targeted exclusion, and the suspension of civil liberties at ports of entry transform the US-Mexico border into a constitutional free zone, or as scholars have argued, into a permanent state of exception. Advocacy groups have led the way in documenting rights violations experienced by undocumented migrants, asylum seekers, and unaccompanied minors at the border or while in custody. While it is common knowledge that border and immigration enforcement agencies operate through secrecy and through limited legal oversight, rights abuses and punishment for denouncing abuse are a normalized part of what it means to cross borders. Now, ample research across the social sciences have unraveled the varying dimensions of state violence embedded in immigration enforcement policies, whether in the interior of the United States, detention centers, or even in the context of the US-Mexico border wall. And political scientists, which is my field, have focused more on the top-down politics of enforcement practices and the impacts on immigrant political behavior, health, and inclusion. Yet, often overlooked are the experiences of people that have this frequent direct contact with the state, specifically transborder commuters. And again, these are US citizens, lawful permanent residents, and not people that hold some kind of non-immigrant visa, for example, a border crossing card or a tourist visa, that regularly cross northbound into the United States through land ports of entry for various purposes, whether it's for work, education, commerce, or family visits. And to be sure, my work specifically looks at the experiences of transborder commuters of Latin American descent. And at these ports of entry, US Customs and Border Protection officers are given ample discretionary power to subjectively determine admissibility of border entrance. And while scholars across the social sciences have examined the detrimental effects of infrequent yet highly violent contact with immigration enforcement officers in the interior of the US, my research really explores what happens when such violence is a mundane part of life in the Mexico-US borderlands. Why are transborder commuters who experience routine state violence in the form of mistreatment and discrimination from CBP dissuaded from filing complaints against their abuser, which again is a fundamental right to hold immigration enforcement accountable? Now, this project is part of my broader dissertation project, which focused on the effects of routine violence at the border on various health and inclusion outcomes. And I used both interview and survey data in addition to ethnographic data. But for this paper specifically, I only look at the interview data because that's where themes of rights violation really emerge rather than specifically from the survey data. So I identified three main reasons, but today I will only talk about two for brevity, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the project during Q&A. So in the first theme, for the most part, transborder commuters I interviewed were typically unaware of their rights or the procedures involved in filing a formal grievance other than speaking to a supervisor, a CBP supervisor specifically on site. Filing a complaint regarding rights abuses at the border often involves navigating a highly complex yet decentralized bureaucratic system. There are 3 organizations tasked with investigating allegations of abuse, and these include the Office of the Inspector General, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and CBP Office of Professional Responsibility. But when these complaints are filed through these agencies, they are either sent back to the station where the abuse originated, which usually results in no independent investigation, or they're bounced around between organizations without any communication about the outcome to the individual who filed the complaint in the first place, or whether any investigation was actually taken. So in the absence of an efficient and accessible immigration bureaucracy, affected individuals usually resort to voicing informal complaints to a CBP supervisor at the port of entry. But this usually involves waiting to speak to a supervisor, which can be a daunting experience for individuals that have already spent hours in traffic to cross the border. Additionally, speaking to a supervisor is not an ideal option for 2 main reasons. First, CBP officers, or supervisors rather, do not have the power to formally or independently investigate CBP officers accused of mistreatment and abuse. Hence, there will be not a record of the incident at the federal level through agencies tasked to supposedly independently investigate CBP. And this problem is really tied to a broader culture of impunity within the agency, as many ex-Border Patrol employees, specifically women, have publicly stated, even allegations of violence and sexual misconduct tend to be hidden under the rug without independent investigations. And actually, whistleblowers who worked for Border Patrol have been criminalized. Second, immigrant advocacy groups like the ACLU or the American Friends Service Committee have documented how speaking to a supervisor can lead to retaliatory treatment. So these bureaucratic barriers reveal intentional practices to make the complaints process as difficult as possible for transborder commuters who already experience significant limitations to their rights at the border. So as a result, transborder commuters in my study mentioned that they distrust a system that is meant to defend CBP officers from any challenges to their power. And the second barrier that I identified in order to denounce mistreatment involved a legitimate fear of a threat of retaliation or even prior experience with retaliation. I define retaliation as coercive, arbitrary, and abusive actions taken by CBP as punishment when transborder commuters spoke up against abuse, asserted their rights, or requested explanations about inspection procedures. Examples of retaliatory measures included removal of visas or a Sentry card. Sentry is the expedited type of like a card that allows you to cross the border quickly, but you have to go through a extended background check. Sending individuals to secondary inspection where they were forced to wait or be heavily inspected, arbitrary detentions or arrests, and subjugation to gender, psychological, and physical violence. Retaliation has to be understood as a key intimidation and coercive tactic to silence transborder commuters from denouncing abuse. And these effects of reprisal were experienced differently according to immigration status, gender, race, and even belonging to a mixed status family. But embedded in these narratives of individuals that I interviewed, especially in regards to the reasons why they did not file a complaint, is that they were acutely aware of how their identities are criminalized. Transborder commuters understood that there's significant limitations to their civil rights and even human rights, and knew that speaking up and complaining about treatment they receive from officers could lead to significant consequences. So as a way to regain agency, many refused to complain as a form of protection. At the same time, they acknowledged that doing so reinforced the cyclical violence that persists at ports of entry, where officers are not held accountable for their actions precisely because they criminalize anyone who challenges their authority, especially if they denounce abuse. The quote on the right, for example, refers to the case of somebody I interviewed, a 62-year-old non-US citizen, Maria from Tijuana, and she recalled a situation when she was in her early 20s, so this was way before the 90s. And she mentioned that on a particularly hot day, she asked the CBP officer why they were taking so long to process people. She was sent to secondary inspection, where she was subjected to a strip search and what she considers sexual assault. And she did not file a complaint at that moment because she was shocked. And ever since, she recalled multiple levels of violence that she has experienced from officers, but that situation really stifled her ability to speak up. So from this excerpt that you see on the right, it shows how she sought to protect her chances to attain citizenship, but at the same time, this fear of retaliation effectively normalizes violence as part of her everyday border crossing experience. So the main takeaway of my research is that it reveals the intentional ways the US government forces victims of CBP abuse into silence through bureaucratic barriers and through the threat of punishment. It serves to normalize a cyclical abuse and to circumvent any challenges to the ample discretionary powers afforded to border enforcement agencies. The effects of retaliation extend beyond the transborder community and can impact US citizens, particularly those who are criminalized for humanitarian and legal aid to immigrants and asylum seekers. In 2019, lawyers for No More Deaths, humanitarian activist Dr. Scott Warren, argued that he was unfairly prosecuted by Border Patrol as retaliation for his humanitarian and life-saving activities for migrants stranded in the desert. That same year, 48 journalists, lawyers, organizers, and immigration advocates were also targeted by CBP, ICE, and FBI for supporting asylum seekers at the Mexico-US border. And a leaked government list, which included the names and the pictures of advocates, revealed that they were being monitored. While I'm sure that the level of violence that I have described is very overwhelming, it just shows how normalized it is within border enforcement, and that abuse is not an anomaly, but the rule. This is the border working as intended. So my research really reveals how the state blurs coercion and consent, and transborder commuters often find themselves surrendering their rights as a form of protection from laws that legalized their criminalization. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. And I look forward to engaging in more conversation with both Erika and the audience.
Hey, thank you so much, Estefanía. I love hearing about your work. So I really wanted to talk about how this same violence is perpetuated against asylum seekers, particularly unaccompanied children, but really any refugee who's trying to seek protection at the southern border of the United States in particular. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about this concept of prevention through deterrence. So prevention through deterrence is the name of a policy started in 1994, meant to strengthen border enforcement in populated areas, to push migrants into more remote areas as a deterrence for them to crossing the border. And so since that policy has been implemented, it's resulted in over 7,000 deaths of folks who are crossing in really remote areas. But I wanted to kind of back up a little bit and talk about this concept of deterrence and use it to really understand the broader treatment of not only commuters, but asylum seekers arriving at the border and those in border custody. The deterrence language is still being used by DHS. I just saw something that came out 6 days ago that talked about the treatment of asylum seekers through the lens of deterrence. And it really includes policies that restrict access to asylum, like Title 42, which recently ended, the recently implemented transit ban for the Biden administration, and the practice of turning asylum seekers away from ports of entry. But it also includes abusive treatment in custody. So we're talking about things like family separation, lack of access to food and medical treatment in border custody, cold, overcrowded, and unsanitary conditions in border holding cells, which are referred to as hieleras or ice boxes by the asylum seekers who get trapped there. And all of these policies are meant to deter individuals from seeking protection in the United States. And the practice of holding them in abusive conditions is meant to make them give up their claims for protection and go back to their home countries. And it's also important to understand that refugees face abuse at the border, whether or not they present themselves at an official port of entry. But we have generally seen worse abuse for migrants who cross between ports of entry, which is a legal way to seek asylum under both US and international law. So there's really few legal standards that govern the treatment of migrants in border custody, and even fewer avenues to enforce these standards. So I want to just talk a little bit about the standards that do apply, and then give a few examples of attempts we've made to enforce these standards, which have largely been unsuccessful. So first, I just wanted to mention the Flores settlement. So this was a 1997 settlement arising out of litigation on behalf of children in immigration custody. It didn't really materially mandate changes in border detention facilities, but instead limited the amount of time that children were supposed to spend there to 72 hours. There's also the US Customs and Border Protection national standards on transport, escort, and detention, which are known as the TED standards. And they dictate the custody standards that CBP must follow. They must provide, for example, medical attention, meals at regularly scheduled times, adequate water, they have to have restroom accommodations, hygiene items, which, as you're going to see with the next few examples, almost none of this is happening, however many years after this has been implemented. As I mentioned, we've been largely unsuccessful at enforcing these standards through either the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office of the Inspector General avenue or through the courts. So I want to talk first about what it's like to actually try to use the enforcement mechanism provided by the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which is an office within DHS, and the Office of the Inspector General, which oversees the agency on the whole. So even when abuse is systemic and well documented, it's almost impossible to bring about changes through that formal complaint mechanism. And I could give you 1,000 examples of CRCL, the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties complaints that we filed, but I can give you 0 examples of accountability where officers have actually been held accountable for these abuses. So one example is in June of 2014, my organization at the time was providing legal services to unaccompanied children in government custody. And through our legal intakes, we discovered rampant abuse of children in Border Patrol custody. I just want to read you a few of the statistics from the report. So we filed on behalf of 116 children. Approximately 1 in 4 included in the complaint reported some form of physical abuse, including sexual assault, beatings, and the use of stress positions by CBP officials. More than half of the children reported various forms of verbal abuse, including racially and sexually charged comments and death threats. More than half reported the denial of medical care. They consistently reported being held in unsanitary, overcrowded, and freezing cold cells. And roughly 70% were held beyond that 72-hour mandated period. Many reported being detained without blankets, having to sleep on the floor with the lights left on. More than 80% described the denial of adequate food and water, including a child whose only available drinking water came from a toilet tank, and others who only received frozen or spoiled food and subsequently became ill. Approximately 15% of the children reported being separated from other family members, and 30% reported that their money or other belongings were confiscated by CBP officials. And many children reported being shackled, sometimes painfully, during transport. So we filed this complaint with the Office of the Inspector General and the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. About a year after some of the children were interviewed by investigators from those agencies, and the attorneys representing these children reported that the children felt like they were being badgered, that the investigators didn't believe them. It felt more like an interrogation rather than an interview of someone vulnerable who had gone through serious abuse. So following the investigation, we didn't really hear anything, but not a single officer was ever held accountable for those abuses. Not a single one. No changes were made at the agency. And I can tell you, since then, I've filed countless CRCL complaints for abuse in border custody, including for parents who were separated from their children during Trump's zero tolerance policy. And even after the change to the Biden administration, not a single officer has been held responsible for family separation or any of the other abuses that we've documented. At this point, we use the CRCL complaints to just be documentation for when we try to bring the cases to court. But even there, it's just been really difficult to get any kind of traction to improve conditions. And the conditions I just described from the 2014 complaint are still exactly the same in Border Patrol custody. Literally nothing has changed. So just going back to the Flores agreement, the settlement generally doesn't cover conditions in CBP custody, as I mentioned, but it has been really difficult to enforce with respect to children being held in Border Patrol stations. So just as an example, that 72-hour limit on border custody is frequently violated. During times of increased migration, we've seen kids held for as long as 30 days before being transferred to an age-appropriate placement in the conditions that I just described. In 2019, several children died in Border Patrol custody, mostly due to preventable flu outbreaks that were caused by the conditions, the overcrowding and the cold temperatures that are endemic in those facilities. So council working on the Flores settlement did manage to get a special master, which is like an independent monitor, to oversee the Texas facilities where the children had died. The special master did produce a report kind of confirming everything I just told you and what we've known is happening for years, but we really didn't see any substantive change. And the special master's jurisdiction was limited to those Texas facilities. So all of those things were happening in California as well, but the Flores team didn't really have a way to enforce them. So we tried to use Flores to enforce the detention standards with respect to children in 2019. We filed several individual suits in the Southern District of California here in San Diego on behalf of children who had eaten rotten food or been served rotten food here in San Diego and San Ysidro Port of Entry. They became violently ill and were refused medical attention. So this included babies. I remember a case we filed on behalf of a 7-year-old who was going in and out of Border Patrol, CBP custody because she was in the MPP program, which forced migrants to wait in Mexico for court hearings in the United States. So basically every time she was brought in for court, she was given the rotten burrito, became violently ill and was denied access to medical care. So we started bringing these suits, and generally the government would just let our clients out of custody, parole them into the United States to just moot the case, basically preventing us from moving forward with litigation so that whatever decision the judge would make would not apply. And that was when we got good judges. We kept filing these individual suits until we got a judge who the government knew would not enforce the Flores agreement just based on his prior decisions. And basically that judge issued a decision saying that we would have to go to the Flores court to try to enforce any detention standards for kids. So again, Flores court doesn't really have jurisdiction here. So we just kind of hit a dead end with the litigation. Around that same time, we asked several members of Congress to conduct surprise visits to the facilities, but our understanding is that CBP would not allow them to come without several days' notice, and they kind of cleaned up the conditions before the members of Congress arrived. So we were not able to get any meaningful congressional oversight to change those conditions. So what are our options here? Generally, attorneys do not have access to our clients while they are in border custody. So it's really difficult to document and stop abuses as they are happening. The US also does not submit to the jurisdiction of international human rights bodies like the Inter-American Court for Human Rights or the United Nations. So we have filed complaints before those agencies, but it doesn't do anything either. So we've been talking a lot with our European counterparts about some of the mechanisms that they've been able to use. As you can imagine, they have a lot of the same issues with abuse in custody. And they are able to rely on the European Commission for Human Rights, the International Criminal Court, and other international bodies to which the European countries do recognize jurisdiction. So they have had some success there. And very interestingly, some advocates have been able to successfully advocate to bring criminal charges against individual border officers who engage in really serious forms of abuse. So unlike in the United States, where most agents have qualified immunity, in Europe, that immunity is more limited. So they do have some more, just some more room to get some accountability there. And so just as my last point, as Estefanía mentioned, the US and European countries have sought to criminalize aid at borders in an effort to deter advocates from protecting the rights of asylum seekers in border custody. So just to give a little bit more context to how this is actually happening. So the examples of both the US and Europe, aid workers are accused of smuggling or promoting illegal immigration, and criminal charges are brought against them, or advocates can be harassed or detained at border crossings or have their travel limited. I went through this when I was on that 2019 watch list, so I could, talk about this for a lot longer, but it does have a chilling effect on advocacy. I can tell you that a lot of volunteers don't want to cross the border. They don't want their century revoked. We have seen multiple volunteers for our organization have their century revoked or have other restrictions on their travel place after they volunteer with us and document rights abuses. So just to close out, I want to mention the situation that's happening here right now. Over the past week, Border Patrol has kept hundreds or over 1,000 migrants detained in an open air holding area between the border walls here in San Diego and then out in the desert a few hours east. Border Patrol has not provided any food. They provided very limited water and have refused to provide any medical care. And we've seen migrants from the ages of 3 months to 80 stuck in these places, and some with really serious medical issues. So we were, along with other groups, able to advocate to have those camps processed. We're already seeing other migrants show up, but I think the way that they're treating those migrants really just illustrates that even after decades of advocacy, we have not been able to move the needle on abuse in border custody. So thank you.
Thank you both. That was very powerful. I'm now going to exercise my moderator privileges and ask our two speakers a few questions based on their presentations. In the meantime, I request that you, the audience, place your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. We are eager to discuss your points of view as well. The first question is, what are the similarities or differences in rights violations experienced by transborder commuters and asylum seekers?
I mean, it seems to me like it's worse for asylum seekers in many ways. It's more systematic. When border commuters are US citizens, I think they do have more rights to bring complaints. I know a lot of my clients have refused to bring complaints because they're afraid it'll affect their asylum case. But even as US citizens, we don't have a lot of recourse, right? So I think it's kind of like they treat asylum seekers worse, but it's not as though even as US citizens, we could really vindicate our rights at the border.
Yeah, I will add, there's differences also in context, right? We're talking about people that are detained, and that's where the most egregious rights violations occur. I will say in both cases, a lot of the rights violations and also like the effects of retaliation, the reason why they're so undercounted is because it's usually done within closed doors. And the difference between what happens with asylum seekers versus, for example, transborder commuters is that there's more like discourse and actual reports from nonprofit organizations or legal advocacy groups documenting retaliation and abuses versus I did a dissertation on this, and there's very few cases where organizations have actually tracked retaliation at the port of entry. And that's the reason why I decided to do this work, because in interviewees' accounts, they talk about sexual violence, they talk about, this is why it's important to talk about the difference between across gender experiences as well, because men, for example, are criminalized in different ways than women. I unfortunately had very few cases of non-binary groups in my study, so I don't want to make generalization of their experiences. But the similarity, I would say, lies more on how it's such a situation of secrecy, and it often happens behind closed doors. And for example, there was a case documented by the ACLU. So they filed a report in 2016 to the office, the two organizations that we mentioned, CRCL and OIG. And one case in particular stood out because it actually happened a lot among the participants' experiences that I interviewed. And in this case, there was a person that was sent to secondary inspections. She experienced abusive treatment from an officer. She tried to speak to a supervisor, and the officer quite literally told her, If you file a complaint against us, we're going to file a complaint against you. Her sentry was revoked the next time she crossed the border, and it took the involvement of Beto O'Rourke to get her sentry back. But that's one of the, it's not often that a policymaker gets involved. And I had an experience, which I was profiled a while ago, where I experienced threats from officers. And what advocacy groups, including the ACLU, told me is to get a policymaker involved. But when I tried to file an intake form for the policymaker involved, there was no, they didn't respond back to me. And to a family member, a similar thing happened. His sentry was revoked. He tried to contact the local policymaker and they did not respond to him. So that just demonstrates how difficult it is to hold border enforcement accountable.
Just one thing to add to that too, I think the treatment of asylum seekers is worse by virtue of the time they spend in custody. The abuses sound similar, but I think something that makes it worse for border commuters is exactly what you're just mentioning. They have to go through this experience again and again, sometimes on a daily basis. And so while asylum seekers might experience really profound abuse over a period of a few days or a few weeks, it's something that is unfortunately a daily occurrence for some of these border commuters.
Thank you. The second question, how does the criminalization of migrant how does the criminalization of migrant aid intersect with the general impunity for border officers who commit rights violations?
Well, in my particular case, I was put on the watch list. I was detained twice in Mexico. I was denied entry to Mexico, sent back to the United States. And then I had an alert placed on my passport, so I couldn't travel basically outside the US or Mexico until years later when I had the alert removed. I would say in the case of my colleagues who went through something similar, right? There was 48 of us on that list. A lot of people have since left the border. They don't want to do border work anymore. A lot of people had their sentry revoked and never tried to get it back. You know, we had a recent volunteer who was filing individual complaints on behalf of Eastern European asylum seekers who arrived last year, and he just had his sentry revoked. So it's something where, you know, we have to tell volunteers at this point, like, you probably will face some retaliation, whether it's having your global entry taken away or you will be stopped and interrogated and sent to secondary. And this has just happened in so many cases that it's something that we have to warn people about. Even if they're doing pro bono work remotely from the United States, we have seen people's global entry or sentry revoked. So it definitely has a chilling effect on our ability to get volunteers to come to the border. You know, I know in Europe too, there's an even bigger threat of criminal prosecution. So again, it has this deterrent effect on aid and really just limits like what we can actually do to help people as well, because we have to be so careful not to cross any line that would result in actual criminal charges being brought against us.
The only thing I will add is that the reason why it's, so a sentry in essence is that it's an expedited type of crossing lane, and you have to apply, you pay a fee, and you go through an extensive background check. There's cases where the sentry card isn't approved for multiple reasons, but there's no way of knowing unless you file a FOIA request. And as probably audience members who are here have tried to, whether they're journalists or activists and they've tried to file a FOIA request, sometimes it takes years to actually get some kind of correspondence. But the fear of having your sentry revoked is something that's held widely by people that have their sentry. And that creates a level of vulnerability. Even though in theory, these are people that have a more privileged standing among people that cross, there's still always that fear. What if I accidentally bring an apple, for example, across the border, and that's grounds for revocation? But in the case of advocates, this is again a way to engage in a type of like a form of social control and to limit their ability to do their job. And unfortunately, even if that sentry card gets revoked, they have to go through so many processes, such as filing a FOIA request, which is incredibly inaccessible. And it takes years to actually get some kind of information from the government why, if they're willing to give it, why it was revoked in the first place.
This next question may be too large to answer in the next 2 minutes, but I'm going to try. Now that Title 42 has ended, how do both of you see the impact on the border? And would informal processes still be the only access to some form of democracy on the border?
Yeah, that's a lot. Okay, well, in terms of the Title 42, I can only speak to like what's happening in regards to transborder commuters, right? And you know, when it ended, there have been images circulating in the media that CBP has conducted more sort of like these routine military exercises where they sort of line up in the middle of the bridge or the port of entry, dressed up in full riot gear. It's just a spectacle of violence to demonstrate what CBP is able to do, including taking lethal force against asylum seekers. The issue is that it's done in the open in front of transporter commuters, and they're not the ones who are quote unquote targeted by these policies. These are asylum seekers. So this generates a lot of frustration by people that are crossing. And also, I talked with Erika about this before, it generates even more xenophobia held by transborder commuters against asylum seekers, even blaming them for what's happening, even though the source of the problem is actually CBP closing off these lines. There's absolutely no reason why they should be doing this. But it's just almost like a campaign to increment violence against asylum seekers and also sway public opinion negatively against asylum seekers. But there's just a lot of excess of militarization that has been occurring as a result of like Title 42. In terms of quickly, I tend to be very pessimistic about reforms, given that, as I have shown, this is a systemic issue. So I lean more toward taking seriously abolitionist perspectives.
Yeah, just one thing I'll add to that is over the past few days, we've seen the border crossing times in the morning go to up to 8 hours here, something that's usually like 1 to 3. And these are people who need to get to work or school or whatever. And so this is largely because, this spectacle of having a lot of migrants stuck between ports of entry, even though entries are actually down 50% from last week. So to me, it's another example, and this has happened many times in the past. Whenever there is a perceived increase of people seeking asylum, CBP will slow down processing of the commuter line and just kind of pit the communities against each other. And I do think it's a way to generate political animus against asylum seekers, to where trying to get border communities to advocate for more limited processing or access for asylum seekers.
Thank you. I'm now pleased to open up this discussion to our audience, who have been patiently waiting for their turn to ask our speakers questions. Our first question from the audience is, what is the utility of CRCL, OIG, OPR, when most of these watchdogs turn over from administration to administration and can't touch CBP's broad expedited removal authority and port autonomy?
Good question. A lot of these sort of like oversight mechanisms, they're so useless that I really just think it's just a way for them to say they have oversight, right? But when you see, I forget the statistic, but I think it's like 94% or 96% of complaints against CBP officers did not result in any kind of, punishment or anything like that. And that's something, like I mentioned, I had seen in practice. So I really think it's just to check the box of having accountability without having actual accountability. I think it would be helpful to have an accountability mechanism that's outside of the DHS agency, because I think just anything within that agency is kind of rotten and they're all going to cover for each other. That's just what I've seen in practice. So I don't think they're useful.
Yeah, and the only thing I will add is that I completely agree with what Erika is saying. And even at the dissertation stage, I had difficulty, for example, finding information because part of the interview process for me involved providing a list of organizations, including legal and mental health organizations, where people that I interviewed could seek help, whether it was for mental health or also if they wanted to file a complaint. But the reality is that I found very few organizations that did this. And also there's because there's so many limitations to civil rights too, it's not like I can point at a website and say, these are your rights. And even people knew what their rights were, there's legitimate fear again of punishment. I think in my case, the only thing that I viewed important, precisely because this is what people voiced in the interviews, is knowledge, like understanding what they can actually do if they desire to do so, given the risks. But I agree that a lot of these organizations, especially even from the perceptions of people that I interviewed, there's not a lot of transparency in what happens. There's been reports even by Kino Border Initiative that they have documented whether CRCL or IIG have actually followed up with cases of abuse, and for the most part, they found that they don't. So we know that these organizations don't work, but at the same time, I do advocate for people to know, just to feel at least that there's some information out there about what they can do if they desire to do so. And a lot of these complaints can actually be done anonymously. But again, even if they're done anonymously, people have a fear that it will be identified. So there's not an easy answer for this other than understanding that the futility really of bureaucracies, but the importance of knowledge.
Understood. And given that no officers have been held accountable from harm, here, give me 1 second, I'm sorry. Given that no officers have been held accountable from harm to asylum seekers and fronterizos, is there anything else that currently appears to be a way forward to accountability, or that can actually bring some change to CBP or Homeland Security?
I think one of the most important things that we need to do is dismantle this bipartisan consensus about border security, because that's really what the problem is, right? So this manifests itself in many ways. One is this constant negotiation between like giving liminal legal status to undocumented people in the United States in exchange for border security. It's really this unquestioned assumption in both parties that border security is a good thing, when in fact it's just violence against commuters, it's violence against asylum seekers, it's even violence against citizens and residents who are caught up in checkpoints on the north side of the border. And so I do think there are some members of Congress who are open to kind of challenging this, but I think there needs to be much more outcry from the public about what's actually happening at the border. I think we've backslid a lot over the past 2 years during the Biden administration. Like this open borders narrative, which could not be further from the truth, has really taken over the mainstream media. And I'm seeing a lot of people afraid of like uncontrolled arrivals, or, you know, thinking that asylum seekers are invaders. So I think we have a lot of work to do just around public perception. But one concrete thing that folks can do is like call your member of Congress, say you disagree with these policies, ask for greater accountability. There are things that Congress can do, you know, just practically that would help the situation. But right now it's kind of like political death for anybody to be like challenging Border Patrol or CBP in any way.
Right. Yeah. And I'll add that even within the last year, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court granted complete immunity to CBP in the Egbert versus Boyle. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it that name right, but it's the Egbert versus Boyle case in which Border Patrol retaliated against a U.S. citizen who sued him for entering his bed and breakfast at the Canadian U.S. border without a warrant and physically assaulting him. But the court unfortunately ruled that CBP cannot be sued for monetary damages or engaging in physical assault of citizens. So while it doesn't sort of grant full immunity still to immigration enforcement, it just demonstrates how the government has positioned immigration agents as state actors with untouchable and limitless power. And that's why it's very important to consider, you know, what Erika accurately identified. And it's just that we have normalized this narrative of border security or nothing else without any regard for human rights. And yeah, that's the only thing we'll add.
We have a few more questions. I hope you both have a few more minutes to spend with us. Our next question is, thank you both for your critical work. Could you comment on the feasibility of the strategy of abolishing ICE that's often raised in the public discourse? If implemented, what would you foresee happening, positive or negative, regarding state-sanctioned practices of violence at the border?
I think what I have seen through like these conversations about abolition is that a lot of people see it as an invisibility precisely because it is so normalized, but it's also important to remember that the call to border abolition or even ICE is not separate from broader calls to abolish prisons, abolish police. So these are all deeply tied, and there's already so many advocates that have identified different ways that this can happen, and it's not something that would happen within like day over night. This is a process, and that's why we need to see sort of like this broader campaign on abolition of ICE and the border as tied with efforts from other advocates that are seeking to abolish other systems of oppression. I don't have much to say about good and bad because I only identify like what is essential. But the reason why this is the only rational response is precisely because of what Erika and I have talked about. And these are systemic issues. The immigration enforcement is built to act this way, and border enforcement can only operate through limits through civil liberties. So, that's why it's important to really consider these debates and movements in order to move forward.
Yeah, I think this concept of open borders is another sort of thing that nobody wants to touch or say, but it is important to consider that those of us with first world passports pretty much experience open borders, like can pretty much go wherever we want, move wherever we want, etc. And the fear over other people having that same right, I think, is mostly rooted in racism, just to be frank. And so I think that piece is important to understand. And then the other thing is just recognizing CBP itself as a threat to democracy. They are the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. They're bigger than every other federal law enforcement agency combined. The vast majority of their resources are geared toward militarized enforcement and abuse of people who cross the border, rather than even the basic, like giving somebody food when they're in your custody, or water, or a diaper, right? So it's just like, I don't think that can be reformed in any way. And as we've seen, without any accountability, it will be impossible to reform. So all of those resources would be better spent supporting those with humanitarian needs who are crossing the border, or just building a more humane immigration system where people can move through legal pathways with dignity.
Erika, I think that really resonated with our audience. You're getting a lot of support in the chat with that. This next question is for Estefanía. Dr. Estefanía, are U.S. citizens subject to similar retaliation and abuses if complaining of mistreatment or abuse? Is there a difference if you are a U.S.-born citizen versus a citizen of Mexican origin?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So for the last part of that question, I interviewed people both that have been born in the US and people that naturalized, and they did talk about how the fear of we're talking about years of uncertainty, precisely because if you cross with a green card, for example, or even a tourist visa, there's always the potential of revocation. So you navigate years crossing with that threat looming in your mind. And so people that are naturalized, that trauma stays with them. So even people that I interviewed, which again, it's not a lot of naturalized US citizens, but the few that I did talk about how they're always afraid that their citizenship is not legitimate, right? And that's part of the other finding that I have in my paper, how people internalize their criminalization, and that uncertainty just really stays with them. But retaliation, as both Erika and I have talked about, this is something that is experienced regardless of your status, but the stakes of it and the consequences are significantly different. Even if we just look at the experiences of, for example, transborder commuters, people that travel with a non-immigrant visa, like a tourist visa, the threat there is that your visa will be revoked. So that will limit a lot of opportunities for people to move across borders. But even if we talk about, which I didn't discuss in today's presentation, but if we're talking about US citizens who travel with a mixed status family, so like let's say the child is a US citizen, but they travel with a family member who is a Mexican national, the fear that they may experience, sure, it might be fear of retaliation against them, but oftentimes it's often fear of retaliation against their parents or people that do not have US citizenship. And that's a lot of the reasons why people sometimes don't file complaints as well, because they think that doing so, speaking up, will affect more vulnerable family members. So citizenship, or rather immigration status, is just one part of the story. And that's why in my paper, I identify the different ways retaliation is experienced, because it's a combination of different factors.
Erika, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to add that the act of revoking a visa is completely untransparent and there's really no recourse. Even revoking Sentry, it's been really difficult to get them back. The only way is like through a political connection, or, you know, there's been some people who've successfully filed lawsuits, but by and large, it's difficult to even get information as to why either a visa or Sentry was revoked. You know, they just say it's law enforcement sensitive information. You can't even really get it through a FOIA sometimes. So I agree that folks who are on just more limited visas where they can just be pulled at the border, they have the most to lose by speaking up. But even US citizens, like if you're flagged and then every time you travel, you are put in secondary and you're interrogated for hours. I do know people that this has happened to who are US citizens, especially border advocates. It's you know, it's hard to deal with, and it definitely makes you think twice about, you know, going to Mexico for the weekend or going to visit family in another country, because you know that that experience is going to be built in. And especially if you're traveling with children or elderly family members, it's like everybody around you is kind of subject to the same abuse. So, you know, it is, I think US citizens definitely have more privilege in terms of bringing complaints, but, you know, there's all different types of violence that can be meted out by border officials, regardless of your status.
And of course, the audience would like to hear more about Title 42, or the end of it. And so how has the end of Title 42 and the new Biden plan affected asylum seekers and border crossing?
So like I mentioned, the surge never materialized. Okay, so, you know, everyone was screaming about this surge and all these migrants were going to come. That didn't happen. The crossings between ports of entry were down 50% after the end of Title 42. And even though CBP is supposed to be admitting folks at the port of entry, they're not processing walk-ups. They're only processing individuals with CBP-1 appointments made through their barely functional app. So I mentioned that a lot of folks ended up going between ports of entry and stuck in those open air holding facilities where they were denied basic detention standards that they should have been afforded, like food, water, medical care, et cetera. And now over the past 2 days, because the border OFO, which is like the border officials that are in charge of the port of entry, have been deployed to help clear out those camps. So we've seen these like 8-hour wait times in the morning where it should only be like an hour or 2 hours. So I think we're going to continue to see that sort of like just playing the commuters off of the asylum seekers. Like if you really, again, take a step back and think about it, if we have less asylum seekers crossing, why are the commuters crossing times like 4 times more than they should be, right? So this is, to me, it all feels like a political stunt. I think a lot of people were disappointed that there wasn't a surge because that would have been very convenient. But I think over the next few weeks, we're going to continue to see this kind of push and pull of people being turned away from ports of entry, going between ports of entry, having officers moved around to process folks, and then having the commuter times be much longer.
Great. And then our final question is for Estefanía. Estefanía, through your research, how have you seen border policies impact the fronterizo community that has existed in the borderland regions for so many generations, or the fronterizo culture in general?
I think it's important to mention that, like, you know, there's families. I mean, being a transborder commuter is not, a lot of people call it a choice, but there's multiple reasons why people engage in community, and at the core, it's you know, people seeking opportunity, but at the same time, there's families that have been doing this for generations. So people that I interview, including myself, like we talk about how the decision to cross the border is something that it's the history through our parents or our grandparents that talk about this. But with that expectation also comes the passing down of fear of precisely these immigration policies. So oftentimes the fears held by their parents get passed down by children. And again, if people travel with a mixed status family, that creates sort of like this collective fear of not what will happen just to me as a US citizen, but to family members who are in more vulnerable positions. But what often does not get discussed, especially when it comes to transborder experiences, something that we touched on here today, but I'm hoping to expand on it more through my research, but it's how, it just becomes so normalized that people don't contest it. And in fact, sometimes even legitimize the violence. This is what we have to do in order to cross the border, or this is the way things are. But this is precisely why it's so important to have these conversations that we, stop the increase of normalization and complacency of violence that occurs at the borders. And the ways that this is very visible is precisely at the port of entry. Transborder commuters, for example, blaming asylum seekers for what's happening when it's really CBP limiting the opportunity to seek asylum, violating human rights as well as international norms around asylum. So, that in sociology, that concept is called symbolic violence, where it's internalized and the source of oppression is shifted away from those that are responsible of oppression to the victims of oppression. So, that's what I would say in terms of like the effects is not just the direct level of violence. It often gets misrecognized as normal. The effect is more people internalizing it, not just at the individual level, but through generations.
And would you both be open to taking one more question? Would that be okay? I want to be mindful of your time and of the audience, of course. If you two were tasked with rewriting the policy and managing implementation, what are the 3 key things you could change?
No border. No, just I don't think enforcement really has a role that should have the role that it's taken on. Of course, there's people smuggling drugs over the border, trafficking, but a lot of that is a function of the border itself, right? Like the stronger the border is, the more organized crime we have here. I just don't see it solving any problems, even for security, right? Because like I said, if organized crime becomes stronger, I would think we would become less safe. So to me, it's just this, again, circular violence that is really rooted in this enforcement focused approach to the border. So I would just get rid of that first. I would have free movement of people because, that's historically around the globe, that's been the human condition, just to be able to move. And this border regime is so recent, and especially this like violent border regime is really a blink of an eye when we're talking about human history. So this is an aberration. This is not the norm. And I think going back to more freedom of movement around the world, especially as climate change is going to force more and more people to move, is imperative just to protect human rights. Because what we see is people who are most affected by climate change and economic issues, et cetera, are most likely to face restrictions as they try to move along borders. So, I mean, I know we're supposed to think of 3, but I think just the one would be really helpful, just to have freedom of movement and just to remove the militarized border apparatus.
Yeah, and the only thing I will add, because I'm in the same, I believe the same things Erika just mentioned, is that we have to remember how profitable it is for the detention and deportation regime to have these systems in place. So it's not just a matter about violence, but just the economic violence involved in detaining people. It's really capitalism. So the combination of capitalism and other forms of oppression. So I have a hard time, thinking about whether there's policy recommendations. Sure, there can be, but are they going to make any difference given what we talked about? my research demonstrates that no. And in fact, people that I interviewed, even if they don't express it, they don't say the word abolition, I usually end my interviews with asking about what is the alternative? In what world do you envision? For the most part, people say, I know it's utopian, but if I could cross freely, if there's a world without borders. So even if people understand that it's a difficult outcome to attain, given that we live in a capitalist system, they understand that this is the only thing that will provide some kind of justice. And to go back to what Erika mentioned, that the system works because there's these restrictions.
I have no words. I think you've left me speechless, which is a feat in and of itself. So I'm just going to share our last screen just for those of us who joined us today in order to share some information about Penn IUR. Oh, I think you're seeing everything now. Believe you see. There we go. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you're not already following us, you can scan our QR code, which is in the bottom left-hand corner. And this is the end of our presentations or our conversations on informality for the academic year, but we are working on additional conversations for the upcoming academic year. If you have any ideas, if you would like to present, please do reach out to us. Our information is available in the chat, or you can also scan the QR code and reach out to us from our contact information that's available online. Thank you again and have a wonderful day. Thank you all for your critical work.